The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the O.R. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, C.O.R.E. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National C.O.R.E. and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Good morning, family. All of the early risers, Brother Ugawa, Sister Robin, Stephen McKenzie, King Pianki, and Lao Tzu. Pretty good. Y'all actually got on before I opened my mouth. Greetings to all of you and others that will be coming on. You know, I love all of y'all, and y'all are among the most dedicated the viewers of this show and really conscious. So I really appreciate you. As you know, this show is about self-knowledge and self-respect and self-love, promoting it. And so, you know, we're dealing with different topics each day. As you know, this Thursday was my birthday, and I would like to acknowledge other people's birthdays. So when you're having a birthday, let me know. If you can, email me and let me know so I can acknowledge it in advance and then on the show. My birthday was Thursday, August the 4th, and I turned 83 years old. I was planning to put up a picture of, it wasn't a picture, it was a live shot of me dancing at my 80th birthday party, which we had in the backyard of my house. We had about 73, 74 people here. It was more of a party to honor people in my life. And we had a live band, and I taped the whole thing. So, and there's some real good music in there. Thank you, Robin. So, and then on that day, that evening, I was interviewed on the Hoppy Show, which I'll go into in a minute, which was quite enjoyable. Thanks, King Pianki, appreciate that. The last week's show was Strategy, the Ultimate Art, and I was noting there that next to God, love, and the truth, strategy is the ultimate art. And so that was something to exchange with you on an introductory basis, not only for what can be done when we're doing work in our communities, but how we can improve our lives in terms of the best strategies for good health, and under oppression, whatever wealth you can achieve, um, and happiness. And please believe me, um, even though we're dealing with this mess called America, there's plenty of room for happiness. It depends on what you do and how you conduct your life, and of course, how your opponents do. So that's not something you always have control over. So one of the things to get out of the strategy piece personally is that it's a real help in day-to-day life because it helps you make the best moves. That's really what strategy is. It's like a dance. It's the best moves. And you do that in a lot of ways. But one of them is whatever you do, think about the consequences of your actions. And it may be some things that look like it's going to be very enjoyable. Might be a romantic relationship or a job or who knows, friendship. But if you see down the road this is going to be damaging to you, don't do it. Don't wait until it hits you in the head. Do it right now. And especially when it comes to relationships. You know what I mean? If you see this isn't something going to work out, don't be trying something. It's like putting on a pair of shoes that hurt. You know what I mean? Don't do it. You know what I mean? So strategy's got a lot of different applications. I want to send out a real warm, heartfelt thanks to Sister Felicia Bradford, who's one of the leaders of the Hoppy family, HAPI. I want to thank her and her family for having me on their show on my birthday. You know, she had proposed Thursday, and then I said, "Oh, that's my birthday." She said, "Well, you want to do it this Sunday?" I said, "Yeah, sure, fine." So it wasn't like she was imposing on me. And also want to thank all the dedicated viewers from this show that showed up to watch it. And I want to really thank Brother Ogawa because he set this up. His Twitter work. Apparently, this lady had been looking for me, didn't know how to find me. So I was here hidden in plain sight. So this hookup was really good because this is an audience that watches Hoppy that is on the same vibes as this show. And so it's generated a significant number of new subscribers to our show immediately. And Sister Felicia was very helpful in putting up this banner and reminding people to go to the show and even put the show up to show them how to click in. So that was very nice. But what I really, thank you, Christopher. What I really enjoyed about her is her consciousness. Her head is wrapped on real good. And she's also close to Brother James Smalls. James Smalls is loved by a whole lot of folks because he deserves to be loved. You know, if you're lovable, you get love. And that's James Smalls. So one of the most enjoyable things was they brought in James Smalls. I already saw he was on the chat, you know, and I already knew that she had called him to talk about me, you know, see what he had to say. And so to have him do his little happy birthday, that's my buddy, James Smalls, and that was real nice. I really, really appreciated that. So that was a good thing. We're going to be doing more of that. And again, Brother Ugawa is on his job, and he's been generating a lot of viewers on Twitter, you know, the distracted channel, and that people watch for a short period of time. But, you know, at the same time, there's some very serious viewers on there. And they also, when they get noticed, they also pipe into some serious stuff. So it's appreciated. So Travel Light and Christopher Clipper, good to have you on. So this show has featured themes on African history, African culture, and African American culture and some history. That's unlike what most African-centered oriented scholars or channels or whatever are doing. It's just one. It's usually just African. And for me, it's a balance of both for a lot of reasons. One is you really can't apply what you've learned from the past unless you're applying it to your present, which is your culture. And the other is we've got a rich culture, and I spend as much time studying it as I do African culture, because this is the one we recreated here, you know. So this whole month is dedicated to African American, or what I prefer to call New African culture. It's not the only month we're going to be dealing with it, but for a lot of reasons, this is the focus for this month. So the topic for today's show is how African American culture was created, the culture that becomes the popular culture of the world and the classical culture of the world. So it's going to focus on how it was created. Of course, for some people, that's an amazing thing, because if you don't have a culture, how are you going to be talking about how you created it? Well, so that's what this show today will be focusing on. It's an introduction to it. And I've had other discussions on this, but this is going into it from a different angle. And then next week, you're going to have the pleasure of discussion with one of the greatest jazz musicians ever, John Handy. If anybody knows jazz, the first thing they'll say is hard work, because that was a 1 million record selling record by John Handy. John Handy played with all the greats: Coltrane, Miles Davis, Dizzy, a host of others, and is still in contact with some of those that are still around. He is the only jazz musician to perform at the Jazz Festival in Monterey, which is the longest standing jazz festival in the U.S., and I'll be going there with my wife next month, and I went last year. He performed 11 times and put on some of the best performances. And John Handy is also a composer. Now, a lot of jazz musicians write music. There's a difference between writing music and composing. John Handy can compose for as many as 100 players. He has a degree in music from San Francisco State University, where I used to teach, and he also taught in Black Studies for a while. So he's a jazz musician, and he's constantly dealing with that now. He's, I think, 87 years old and in good shape. But he's also a jazz listener, and he has listening circles that he belongs to and everything else. He's a real artist. And so we're going to be having a very interesting discussion on the high point of African American culture, because this is the thing that we'll be talking about today. We have two things we did in this country around this subject. We created a culture and an art form. And that art form is like the icing on the cake of the culture. We often confuse the art form with the culture. And those of us who don't think we have a culture, we just rely exclusively on the music, which is the highest expression of the culture, largely because the drum was outlawed. And so it required us to go in and draw on those other features that inspire us, which is singing. And so the singing became central. And so it's not that we had more singers come in here, it's that due to the circumstances of this culture, singing became the sine qua non of the culture, one of the highest expressions. And then, of course, the instrumental culture which follows the voice. Brother Garber wants to know what's a listening circle. These are jazz enthusiasts who sit down and listen to the music and make comments on it. Because the music's complex, and you often don't know what you're listening to if you don't know the dynamics of jazz. And the best rappers have been jazz influenced, because that's the deep thinking. The best thinkers in our country, Malcolm X and others, jazz thinkers, Toni Morrison, jazz thinkers. Me, I'm a composite. Jazz, blues, spiritual blues, gospel blues. So I bring in, you don't hear me, but when I'm giving a speech, then it's a lot of the down home stuff, but it's always got depth to it. So mine is a multiplicity, but the depth is coming from jazz, but the feeling is coming from the rest of this stuff. And so this is the high point of the art form. The European American does not have a culture indigenous to this country. That culture was imported from Europe. And it's an oppressive culture. And it's a repetitive and imitative culture because they haven't originated anything here. And so their political system is John Locke. Their economic system is Adam Smith. I mean, every component of their system is based on something they pulled out of Europe. And so ours had to be recreated here. So it's got roots here. You know what I mean? And that's why it's the popular culture of the United States and the popular culture of the world, because it speaks to the human condition. But then in the midnight of enslavement, we also created an art form, starting with the spiritual blues. All of the art form springs from that. And I'll tell you, any part that anybody plays with that diverges from this, it'll lose its beauty. If you sound too tough, too rough, and you're up here not sounding beautiful, you stepped outside the realm of your culture because it's about beauty. And if anybody would know that, it's the people that underwent the greatest ugly experience in history. So you build a house, you always stand on the foundation. So the spiritual blues for the art form is the foundation from which all other components of the art form spring. Hip hop is urban blues. So the main thing is beauty, baby, beauty. You hear me? When God hears any of this, God's light shines brighter. That's according to Fool's Crow. I've talked about him before, the greatest holy man among the Lakota people. He said God's a sucker for music. Well, then that means God's a real sucker for Black music when it's right. You know what I mean? Huh? Because God's got ears, vibratory ears. Of course, God has no ears, but I'm talking about the light has realms of feeling and drawing that's far beyond ours. And of course, Pythagoras, he taught that he learned this in the Kemetic mystery system, that the planets, the stars, all emit sound, music, because God is the greatest artist. God's the greatest musician. You hear me? God is the greatest manifestation of love. I know I've experienced it, and most of you should know, and that's the light inside of all of us. So next week, we'll be getting into jazz, baby. And by the way, the brother we'll be interviewing, John Handy, is also a former boxer, and he was a lightweight champion. And he's put some little messages on some of his fellow musicians that thought because he was small, they're going to get off on him. He just warned them. John's real nice, so you'd never think he had that. But he's Texas, and Texas has faced rough and tough. And so you're going to really enjoy this. And John Handy was also in the San Francisco Freedom Movement. He was in charge of our Freedom Band. He got arrested a number of times. He's a very conscious brother. So this is going to be real nice, The last two shows of the month, the 20th and the 27th, we'll be showing a film that I just had shot the first part of on one of the heroes in the Black arts, Black Power, and Black Freedom movement, Dingane, Dingane, then known as Jogan Calvis, and he was chair of San Francisco C.O.R.E's Education Committee, and he was later a leader in the Black arts movement, producing the Journal of Black Poetry that produced more Black poetry in the Black arts movement than any other publication. And a lot of people don't know about this journal. And he funded it out of his own pocket because that was the spirit of C.O.R.E. We funded everything out of our pocket. So this is Unknown Hero. And so I put my own money into putting this film out. And I would hope people continue to make contributions to the show, but to honor him. And then on 2 o'clock on the 27th of August, we'll be having a outdoor celebration on 73rd in Oakland. I'll give you the address next week, 2 o'clock on, and to, celebrate him in the community. And Sister Sonia Sanchez, one of the great poets of the Black arts movement, she will be piped in through Google and will give a eulogy. I'll be giving a general presentation on Dingane, and she'll be giving a eulogy. And Sonia Sanchez was also a member of C.O.R.E in New York. So we're going to be dedicating the last two shows, the 20th and the 27th. We'll show part 1 and part 2 of this film on Dingane on each of these shows. And on each of them, we'll have some comments that people can make after the show. Now, when it comes to today's topic, how African American culture was created, and I hope you all appreciate the cover or the promotional leaflet that's done by Brother Cinnabar, who's my computer tech person. And it's a picture of Charlie Parker and Zora Neale Hurston. And this brother has real good taste, Brother Cinnabar. And they kind of embodied two different things about the culture. Zora Neale Hurston, a master about knowing and living the culture, because she comes out of a Black town, Eatonville, which is one of the first all-Black cities organized by Blacks in the United States, and then went on to get a degree in anthropology, studying under Franz Boas. And she centered herself on our culture and practiced it at the same time. So I've read just about all her books. She is someone you have to know to be grounded in the depths of the culture. She is one of the most important people, one of the most important. As I pointed out before, her best work is Mules, M-U-L-E-S, and Men. And of course, Her Eyes Are Watching God. That was a novel. People are, knowledgeable of that, and that's beautiful. But Mules and Men, that's where she literally dived deeply into the culture. Actually, was initiated into voodoo, and she was dealing with voodoo in the South. And then she wrote another book on voodoo in Haiti, where she went also and studied that. And then Charlie Parker. They called him Yardbird or Bird because he was in a car and drove over a bird, and then they pulled that bird out and cooked it. Because those were times, man, if you got a free chicken, you got it. You know what I mean? So that literally Bird was the reason he got that name. Charlie Parker is one of, also called Bird, is one of the greatest musicians produced in this country or the world, and he's an innovator along with Dizzy Gillespie and Thelonious Monk of bebop, the most complex musical innovation in the 20th century, and a music that brought the roots of Black music back to its source, polyrhythms. Because a lot of the attack on the culture was an attack on the drum, for example. And so when the drum was outlawed, we just took the rhythms other places. And the most important place was the spiritual blues. And in everything else we did, the whole body became a drum. And then we brought it back. And so bebop is an example of re-Africanizing the music. And Charlie Parker was like the bird, literally the beauty, and he drew heavily from the blues. And Dizzy was more the architect, the intellectual. And so he did all of this. And so was Charlie Parker. Charlie Parker, deep thinker. These guys would spend a lot of time talking about quantum physics. You understand? But Dizzy had all these complex things he could do with an instrument, you know. And Dizzy was a philosopher. His book, To Be or Not to Bop, you should read it. One of my specials is African American music. The other one is the Black Church. And the other one is the Black family, to which I hold the paradigm on the world for African families. So I don't just deal in the ancient, but I deal with this. And one reason is I come out of Black liberation movement. That's an active culture. It's everyday Black people that woke me up. They got me in the movement. I know what this culture is. You know what I mean? And so I spent a lifetime appreciating it. It's what I came out of with my mother and father, and my grandmother and great grandmother, as you all do. And so that was the real reason that my thing is both African and African American, or African and New African. It's both. You hear me? You know what I mean? As we get into this topic today, you should also go back and watch and listen to the speech entitled African American Culture, a Culture, Not a Subculture. African American Culture, a Culture, Not a Subculture. Unlike this, these are talks. My best form is speaking. I mean, I love it. And especially speaking on certain occasions that are really important. But any one of them I enjoy. I enjoy speaking in the Black church because the Black church carries the aesthetics, as Ella Baker said, of the Black community. It's true beauty there, you know. And then, of course, I enjoy speaking before different audiences. And this particular audience was in Atlanta, Georgia, and it was delivered February the 22nd, 2003, before a group called the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement that is still in operation. And the occasion was the assassination of Brother Malcolm X. It's a yearly banquet. And I've said this before, for those that haven't heard it, I say it again. Dr. Asa Hilliard, who's one of our great scholars who passed on, was one of the most popular speakers in the country. He was always on the road speaking. And so he made a point of flying into Atlanta, Georgia to hear my presentation. He's my buddy. And this was a speech delivered maybe 6 months before my book, The Integration Trap, Generation Gap, Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures, was published. And so it drew from some themes in this book. So Asa had flown into Atlanta, but it was too cloudy. The plane couldn't land. He had to land at another airport, rented a car, and came straight to the speaking engagement. He hadn't had time to take a shower, to get out of his sweats or nothing. That was Asa, and was really beautiful. You know what I mean? And so this speech was dealing with the topic African American culture as a culture, not a subculture. And so I went into some of the central precepts of African American culture. The book, The Integration Trap, which came out later, which some of you have bought. I don't know how many of you have bothered to read it, and I know most of you haven't bought it. This book is multi-dimensional. It has many features to it. So one feature is the revitalization of African and African American communities. That's one. And it was focusing on a vision that God gave me. I've addressed this in some previous presentations. It's the best analysis on why we're in the shape we're in right now since 68 and how we get out of it. And it's also a good analysis for the world African community. This book deals with the world's first people. It's a follow through in some ways on the mother principle, return to the African mother principle of male and female equality. So I'm going back to the first people, the Twa, and I'm looking at some things that I didn't cover in the mother principle on the culture of the Twa, and particularly the spirituality of the Twa. And we have a series that I think it was 5-part series that we just recently did on the Twa, and that covers other areas. So the reason for doing that was that my conclusions around the state of the Black community today in this country and globally is that no program is going to work unless it has culture tied to it. The depths of our culture, both African and New African. And seeing as how the generation gap is the biggest divide in the Black community, culture is really the bridge over which, you can bridge the cultures. So that was part of the reason for going back to the Twa. And then it was also to show that I'm shaping a new school of history. And that new school of history is based on a Twa foundation. So then the third chapter moves into how the Twa then give birth to agriculture and set up the first agrarian systems in the world, agricultural systems in the world. And then there's a chapter dedicated to showing how they founded ancient Kemet, a subject that our scholars don't deal with, which is what they call pre-dynastic Kemet. I'll tell you what I've done with this period, because I'm owning this period, because it is the foundation for the greatest classical civilization. It is the basis. All of the elements of civilization was not created after 3200 BC. It was created 10,000 BC as a pharaonic civilization, probably around 6,500 BC. Our scholars don't study that. And this is my specialty. Why? Because one, it's an area that's uncovered. I'm not going to go into what people have covered well. P.A.P.O, Obenga, they've covered dynastic Kemet well. I don't need to cover that. So I'm covering what hasn't been covered, but for a reason, because this is the root. And it's the foundation of the creativity of ancient Kemet, but also the most just periods in Kemetic civilization. So a chapter is devoted to the Anu, which is on the front cover. This is this little one here. And he's got his left foot forward, staff of authority. That's a symbol. The left foot forward is of nobility. The staff of authority is of eldership, and it is the symbol for Medu Neter and Medu Nefer, because as Dr. Jacob Carruthers pointed out, Medu means staff. Neter, N-E-T-H-E-R, it's the staff, in this case, of God's word. It's the staff of authority of God's word. And it's interesting that it would be the staff of an elder, which is the closest thing that humans have, if this elder is wired up correctly, to a connection to God. And so, but this carving here is the oldest proof that Kemet was founded by Black folks. And you can see little Black folks, Twa, called Anu, A-N-U. You all know my first love is the Twa. Why? I love justice. And they're the most, in fact, they are just. It's not they're the most just. They are most just. Period. You hear me? The pure ones, as they call themselves. And we've gone through this in previous presentations. So when Sheikh Anta Diop and Dr. Theophilus Benga, both of them doctors, presented their case for the blackness of Kemet at the UNESCO conference in the 70s, where all of the foremost mystifiers of white colonial history, some of whom had been their teachers, had assembled. And it was Diop and his best student, Dr. Theophilus Benga. You should go back to the conversation that I had with Obenga in March of last year. He'll be on the end of this year. We've talked, he'll be on. And so what was the best proof that Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop presented to prove that the pharaonic civilization of Kemet was black? It was this right here, right here. If you bother to read this book, you will read Dr. Theophilus Benga's translation of the Medu-Neter script, which Petrie, who was a French historian, had misinterpreted. And so, and this was eye-opening to Obenga because he hasn't studied what's called Pre-Dynastic Comet. And I'm going to share something with you. This is an incorrect term because I'm owning this period right here, this early period, the foundation period, because historians agreed on this. With the foundation of Kemet, Kemet's in decline in the first dynasty. Why? Because all the greatness of Kemet had been already achieved. All the elements of civilization had been created by these little people, of whom their leader was Ani. That's a C.O.R.E. Ani is A-N-I is the name for Anu. And what does Anu mean? Again, on the top, you see the 3 vertical registers. That means great ones. So I'm finishing a book right now on Seba, which is replacing the Western system for teaching. And it's dealing with the mastery systems that we talked about a few weeks ago. And then I'm going to be doing a book on the San Francisco Freedom Movement. And then I've got another one. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I've been laying this baby out. So I got another one. And it's going to take this baby here and take it somewhere else. It's not just here. It's going to be extremely important. I haven't been writing for the last 2 or 3 weeks. I've been reading new stuff and going through new stuff because I've had a new insight. But the key point is this. You can't call this pre-dynastic Kemet. Why? Because pre would suggest that this is before the dynasties. The first dynasty was the dynasty of Ani, or Asar, or as the Greeks called him, Osiris. And we know he's a real person. As Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop has pointed out, his head has been found in a jar in Obidos, Kemet. And I have an actual, and I've shown it on this show a couple of times, a wooden statue. That's him. Because in the ancient period, the priest and some of the pharaohs, they were edified in wood, not in stone. And this one is so eerie and lifelike that it is not a generic picture as you have of the Ramses statues that look like someone that went to the gym. That isn't exactly how Ramses looked. But if you look at Tutankhamun, that is a reflection of how he looked, you know. So this particular wood carving is a representation of him. So I'm saying that since the first dynasty was back then, I think it's around 6500 BC, but well before the 3200 period. And we know that Asar or Ani wore 2 crowns, so that he had both upper and lower Kemet. And my research shows this was a peaceful period. The research I'm doing right now on this ancient period, The artifacts that I've been examining and stuff like that, there's not a weapon in one of them. And it's in a peaceful period like this that you could evolve all these elements of Kemetic civilization, the language, the spirit system, the philosophy, you name it. The system of physics and astrophysics, all of it. You know what I mean? So I've renamed this period, but I think the founders would agree with it because I haven't invented no name. This ain't no pre-dynastic period. This is the period of the great ones who established Kemetic civilization, the greatest classical civilization in the world, just as the ancestors that these Anu drew from created world civilization on which this civilization was based. So that's just a little side point. But the main chapter in this book, it covers other things, but the main chapter in this book is almost 100 pages. It's on African American culture. That was the point of writing that book. You hear me? So if you really want to get into this, you should read this book, The Integration Trap, Generation Gap Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures. In fact, I know some of you that watch this show are readers. Hope all of you are, because you got to have depth in anything you do in life if you're going to do it well. And if you're a mother, you got to be able to pass something on to your children. But for your life, the more you know about yourself, the stronger you will be. So that is part of what this book was about, and part of what I'm drawing from today, but I'm going beyond what's in the book. I'm doing other stuff in terms of looking at our culture, this new African. Remember, as Cabral said, the liberation movement's an expression of culture. You can't get free unless you draw from the best aspects of your culture. The biggest failure our liberation movements have had is when the leadership has not fully ingrained themselves in the operative principles of the culture and worked on themselves. And none of us do it fully. So it's constant work. But to the extent that you've got cultural gaps, chances are a movement's going to have gaps, especially if it's dependent on singular leadership, which it should not be. So my topic for today is how African American culture was created. Now, a number of historians have put forward the same thesis that a whole lot of remote control, automatic pilot, 00 soul Negroes buy into. And I'm not putting them down for this, but that's what puts you in this position of being remotely controlled. I have a presentation that's on the site, and it's a presentation where I spoke at Merritt College and before about 150 Black students. And the first question I asked them was, how many of you think we have a culture and how many don't? Everybody raised their hand that we don't. That's the assumption of too many of our youth, and that's been passed to them by too many of our misinformed adults, including too many of our misinformed scholars. You understand? And, you know, they run around like they're dealing with the people without a culture. The only way you don't have a culture is if you get wiped out. If you are eliminated, you might have artifacts after that. If you wrote anything, they may be books about you and everything else. The last of the Mohegans, when the last one went down, it was a Native American, you know what I mean? Then that's when the culture went down. No, it didn't completely, because Native Americans share a common culture. So there are other Native American groups that continued it. You know what I mean? But we've been sold this Billy Goods. They took our culture in slavery. And I want to requote something that I said last week from Dengani, the brother we're going to be honoring this month. In his Journal of Black Poetry, he was critiquing Harold Cruz's Christ of the Negro Intellectual, thought it was a good book. And then he made this comment, because he was political. And he was my best advisor, too. He was his own leader, but I was always listening to him for advice, and he helped me with so many different things. So he said, how could a people with a garbage can culture convince another people that they don't have a culture? How could they? Good question. Now, I must say, all of our people don't buy that. We got a significant number of Black folks that know that we have a culture and who are deeply in it, proud of it. The sister that I had on, Kuji Chagalia, who's a former student of mine, she was on last year. And you want to talk about a fine sister, my goodness. In fact, her and her husband hooked up in my African philosophy class. I've hooked a lot of people up unintentionally. And she's somebody, she's in the All African People's Revolutionary Party, Kwame Touré's organization. She's a revolutionary sister. And she's got one foot in the African world, the other in the African American world. And she got two daughters look just like her, both school teachers, identical twins that had the same orientation, more or less, you know? So there's a lot of folks out there that appreciate that we got a culture, but there's a whole lot that don't. And you're in a world of trouble. It's kind of like, you're going into a pawn shop and you kind of broke and, you need some money. And so you got a piece of jewelry, you got a pawn, you know what I mean? But you don't know that this jewelry is diamonds. And I'm not into diamonds, by the way, but you don't know it. And so this guy can go in there and put his little thing on there and do a scientific thing and say, well, the gold is worth something. I'll give you $200, but this thing's glass. And if that's what you know, that's how you're going to go. You know what I mean? And so here we got the greatest jewel that any people can have, a magnificent culture. And we act like we don't have one. That's a tragedy. A tragedy. Because then you don't see the strengths that you have inside of yourself. One of the points I've made over and over again on this show is one of our greatest weaknesses is we underestimate our strengths. And sometimes we don't even know them. So your culture is the greatest strength you've got. And it was forged under some of the most difficult circumstances as it was reforged, but it comes out of the depths of the most beautiful culture that humanity has created. And I'm not knocking other cultures because there's a lot of beautiful cultures. I'm just saying this is the most resilient. This is the first. It's a foundation for others. And some that are messed up today, they've completely departed from it. So they're in a world of trouble because everybody sprang from us. But some of them got off course. So one of the reasons we're misinformed is some of our scholars are. In fact, too many of them. So one of our great scholars, great sociologist, and in many ways a master thinker, was E. Franklin Fraser. And E. Franklin Fraser wrote the book Black Bourgeoisie, and he was a good man. So I'm not here trashing him. I'm just pointing out a big error he made, but that is a expression of an error that too many of our historians have made. And some of our people who call themselves cultural nationalists, they've created their own version of cultural nationalism, but never bothered to study the culture of Africans in America, never critiqued it. I'm not going to name names. I don't get into the personality thing. You figure that one out. You know what I mean? How are you making a comment on culture? You put some stuff out there of your own, but it's the popular culture of the world. It's the classical culture of the world. It is the most complex culture in this country, which means it's probably the most complex in the world. And you're making commentary on culture, which is your creation, and you haven't bothered to study this. Because you bought the idea that we don't have a culture. That's why. And now you can't hold up on that. You'll deny it. There are people who have taken this position and they'll deny it. But if you look at the whole Black liberation movement in the 60s, the Nation of Islam basically took the position we didn't have a culture. They rejected almost everything we ate, didn't want us to shake our hips. You know what I mean? And with Elijah Muhammad, had no interest in Africa at all. And Malcolm would make comments like that, but Malcolm was pulled in both directions because he had come out of too much depth of African culture, even in the streets when he was into his little crime life, that he knew better and had a deep appreciation of African American music, and was reading some of the best stuff. He was reading Lerone Bennett's Negro Mood just before he died. And I've told you this before, I've told millions of our, a number of our scholars to read it. None of them have read it. None of them. But tell them there's a book on the pyramids, boom, they're going to grab it, and they should. But your own stuff, you figure they could be too much in that. Well, that's the real gold mine. You hear me? So it was E. Franklin Fraser and scholars like him, but I'm going to focus on his argument. There are others who put forward this argument, but I'm going to focus on his. And this was his commentary on the state of culture of Africans in America. He said this, and I quote him. I'm quoting him because I don't want to distort what he said, because when I critique it, I'm going to critique it on the facts. And by the way, I'm not a fact man. I use facts. I'm into creativity. And so I'm into trying to create something new. So I'm just not out here fact this, fact that. But to back stuff up, facts, baby, facts. So this is what he says about our culture. In contrast to the situation of the West Indies, that's the Caribbean, African traditions and practices did not take root and survive in the United States. Let me repeat that. In contrast to the situation in the West Indies, African traditions and practices did not take root and survive in the United States. Now, I should point out, he doesn't give any evidence for this, but this is his assertion. And I know a whole lot of Black scholars who will die on this, and they are the same ones that will have trouble when you put Africa in front of anything. They just want it to be Black. They don't understand that this thing that they like that's Black, it's African. So Fraser gave us his reasons for this, that according to him, the culture of Africa was destroyed in the United States because when Africans were brought to this country, they were separated into small numbers and shipped to different plantations. And in these plantations, enslaved Blacks had only a dim memory of Africa. Now, that is what a lot of people will say. They separated us so that we couldn't talk to each other. You know what I mean? We couldn't converse and blah, blah, blah. And there's a whole lot of holes in that one. I'll go into that in a minute. But that's the basis for his assertion. And of course, you get dropped into these communities, a few here and a few there. And the people you're going into are kind of zombies when it comes to Africa. I'm going to critique that too. But that's the basis of his premise. And there's a lot of other scholars like St. Clair Drake, who's an outstanding scholar. He co-wrote a book on Black Metropolis. He was also a sociologist. And by the way, I should say, sociologists are not really the best ones to be critiquing history unless they go study some, you know what I mean? And we got a bunch of psychologists that do the same thing, and they end up talking about we sick. And by the way, I'm going to make this comment, get you all really riled or whatever. I have a brother who took my place at San Francisco State, Dr. Siri McDougall, brilliant young man, beautiful young man. I picked him as my replacement. Wade Nobles was retiring. He picked his replacement. His replacement didn't turn out too good. I knew mine would, because he had two signs that would indicate that. I just look at you and I can see this first sign, good home training. Hey, that means a good ethical base and a bunch of other stuff. And then the other thing I was looking for is discipline, because I'm leaving. I was in my 60s then, and my replacement is going to be somebody that can take the discipline forward. And they got to be young. There's a lot of older people pushing me, and they were good, but they got to be young. And so I saw the discipline. This guy has now produced 2 books. One on one of the shows we did, it was on Black youth. It was Black Masculinity, a book on Black masculinity that's outstanding, and a book on research methods. He is really into solid research. That's won awards, you know. So I was talking to him. We talked earlier this week. And I just made this assertion because he knows my position on all this stuff. And when he first came in to start teaching, because I was now on an early retirement program, he sat in on my most important class for the whole semester, African philosophy. That was smart. But that also showed he understood the foundation of things. Ended up marrying a Swazi woman from South Africa, a very nice sister. You know what I mean? So we were talking, and I just dropped this thing. I said, there's no data that can prove this, because we're dealing with 40, 50 million Black folks, whatever. We don't even know the numbers because the census ain't right. It's more than they say. But based on my knowledge of Black people, I can say this, that if you're looking at the average Black family, it's normal. And I said, what do you think? He said, oh, yeah. And then he said, a lot of our psychologists would disagree with this, because if you're in psychology, you got an investment in being sick, and then they've been trained to see it that way. You know what I mean? So guess what? At the end of slavery, and this is Naim Akbar making this comment. Naim Akbar is one of our great Black psychologists, one of the founders of the Black psychology movement. He made this after he did his best work on the psychological dimensions of slavery. He was talking about all the things we got that was wrong. He made this comment at the end. 2 comments he made. One was, but we need to study African-American culture, or the residuals. Now, I would have never written that book until I had done that, but that was an honest statement, you know. So you're going to be talking about what's wrong with Black folks. Well, what's right? And then which balances out greater? Huh? But this is the conclusion he made, because this guy's a brilliant man. He made this comment. Africans came out of slavery normal. You're darn right. And if we were normal then, we're even more normal now. You might say, well, we gone more nuts because of drugs and because of a whole bunch of other stuff. But that ain't most of us. So that's the other point that I want to make about that. You ain't going to come out of the most horrendous experience that humanity could have normal unless you got something extremely, extremely powerful to draw from. And that's your culture, baby. That's your culture. You hear me? And this boy up here talking about, we lost our culture. I pointed this out a million times before. The only way people lose their culture, I just said before, you get wiped out. You got to be genocided. That's the only way culture goes. Culture changes, transmutates. It does all kinds of things. It never remains the same. As that song goes, everything must change. Nothing remains the same. And so, but it's culture that carries you through, and all the elements of culture. So I'm going to show that this conclusion is basically based on wrong assumptions and really poor, if any, historical data. But before showing the errors in E. Franklin Fraser's conclusion, I want to acknowledge what he got right. Okay? He's right. And I made this point before, that the culture of Africans in the Caribbean and in another way, South America, but I focus here on the Caribbean, is more African than the culture of Africans here. It's a hybrid culture. And that means mixed with African and European elements, but the African elements overwhelmingly prevail. Why? Because they were 98% on those islands. You just didn't have enough white people present to try and get into your business. So it continued with influences coming from, European culture, religion, language. But all of those got changed because the African was primary. So African cultures drop there with the people. They just come in and just continue the way things are going. Now they get catching hell, so don't let me leave the impression that everything's nice. No, it's just that the European doesn't have the numbers to wage the cultural war that they would try and wage here. And by the way, a trash can, garbage can culture, they ain't got much to operate on. So when they are doing their number, it ain't very sophisticated. That's why the Willie Lynch thing was a joke to begin with. And people who fell for that, again, they're the ones that bought but the idea that we didn't have a culture. Black people waged cultural war from the moment our foot was put on these enslaved ships, to the moment that we hit one of those plantations. And it was a sophisticated cultural war because we came out of complex cultures. We were going up against unsophisticated, savage, brutal people. That wasn't hard to keep your culture going under those circumstances, contrary to popular opinion. It took creativity, but it didn't take a whole lot of mind transplant. It wasn't like you were going up against 10 Einsteins here. Willie Lynch had a plan. Willie Lynch, his plan was to make money. His plan was to do anything to you, and there was no Willie Lynch. How in the hell could you have a Willie Lynch in slavery when lynching only occurred after slavery? How could that be the name of the person that came up with this? And we were collectively going up against this system with collective warfare. Remember, our motto was resistance. And so if you told the enslaved African to do something, he'd find a way to do something else. That was his spirit. If you studied history of enslavement, you'd know that. They were more resistant than we are now. You understand? In all kinds of different ways. It wasn't always in your face. They were smart, So E. Franklin Fraser is right that in the Caribbean, a pure form of African culture emerges because of the conditions there. The development of African American culture in the U.S. was more complex. But what Fraser and those who take his position didn't understand is that African American culture stands on an African foundation with new African creations, and because New African is taking something that was African and reworking it in a new way. But then there are African cultural traditions that just continue straight on up. Straight on up. This, by the way, isn't in the Integration Trap book. Most of this isn't. Straight up, there were institutions that continued, contrary to popular opinion. I'll talk about those later. You hear me? So certain features of African culture couldn't survive here, and certain ones couldn't survive in the Caribbean either. And some that could survive there couldn't survive here, like polygamy could survive in the Caribbean. Why? Because everybody's Black. Black man's going to want him more than one woman. That's going to prevail. And so you have the tradition now in the Caribbean of the outside wife. And surprise, surprise, husband comes home one day with a baby, and suddenly the wife knows that there's another wife. But usually she knew earlier because in these islands, word spread, So that's the continuation of that. Now, because it's a hybrid culture, you've got this thing, mixed. So you got this thing where this Christian thing, this monogamous thing is looking at you and saying, that ain't right. So particularly the wife is often against this. But the outside wife, she's saying, if anything, I like to take her place, but at least you're going to have to deal with me. You know what I mean? So that's a continuation that a lot of brothers just wish could have happened here. You know what I mean? So that's one case where intrusion of the white folks kind of prevented that. And so you've kind of taken this monogamy as a norm, and most of the sisters are quite happy. I'm not polygamous by nature because I'm a child of Obatala, and Obatala is the oldest of the Orishas. These are spirits from heaven. And Obatala had only one wife and decreed that all of the Orishas should only have, these are ancestral spirits, should only have one wife. And they said, sorry, we're agents of God. Hell, if men down here can have more than one wife, why can't we? And we'll even make better choices because we're Orishas. I'm kidding there. They didn't say that, but it's a joke. But they did say they were not going to go with one wife. So that didn't survive. The drum couldn't be abolished in the Caribbean. I made this point before, or South America. It was banned here, but it went undercover because just about every rhythmical move we made was drum-like. And so it continued on, and then we brought it back as soon as we could, But it was maintained in the spiritual blues because the spiritual blues and gospel blues are the most African of African American music. Why? Polyrhythmic. Whereas blues is monorhythmic, 1-2, So that was continued because you just can't take a culture and just remove it. And so this got transmuted into other forms. Now, in the case of languages, in neither the Caribbean nor the U.S. were the pure African languages of Africa, Yoruba, Asante, whatever, continued in its pure form. And here is a case to show you that, and this is the last case I'll make when I finish this presentation, to show you that if a linguistic system, in this case, an African linguistic system continues, that is the best proof that your culture prevailed. Because the way you talk is an expression of your philosophy, your view towards life. It is ingrained, it's central to you. So what's interesting is in the case where the African in the Caribbean has the numbers, and the African in America is overwhelmingly outnumbered in numbers, but you're going to see it's more complex than that. In both cases, they come up with an African-based language. And it's called Creole in the Caribbean. Our scholars who specialize in linguistics call it Ebonics here. I'll go into that more later. I'll just simply assert. You better believe it prevailed. Huh? Fraser, I'm sure, didn't know nothing about this, Be careful about what you don't know. What I mean? It's going to come back and slap you upside your head. So an African linguistic system prevailed in the United States and still does. And not just among the Geechees. And we'll talk about that in a minute as well. People in South Carolina who have the purest expression of that. And when language prevails, some of the deepest stuff in your culture prevails. You hear me? Huh? So, in the case of what the West calls religion, which Africans had none of. Africans had spirit systems, but they'll always call it religion. So get straight what I'm talking about. So in the case of the Caribbean, and this is true for South America as well, what is interesting is that the African in the United States and the African in the Caribbean maintain the same spirit practices depending upon the religion of the oppressor. So wherever Catholicism was practiced in the United States or in the Caribbean, what you have prevailing is a closely intact African spirit system with the priesthood, with a divination system, with a way of bringing spirits down to possess them. So that's called voodoo in the Caribbean and in South America. They call them Santeria in Cuba, Candomblé in Brazil, voodoo in Haiti, voodoo in Louisiana. What does the blues sing about? I got my mojo working, and I'm going to sure make it work on you. Mojo is that magic that comes out of what in the South was called hoodoo, but is a part of obia. And obia, which is the spirit practices of Africa, is found prevailing in the Protestant countries because they are vigilant. It doesn't matter whether you're a majority or minority on the land, they are vigilant in going against any expressions of full African spirit, or you'd call religious systems. So Jamaica is as much involved in obia, or at least involved in it, as we are, as Barbados is because they're Protestant countries. So any country that had Catholicism, that's where a pure African spirit system, religious system, that sometimes is stronger than Africa in that it becomes a Pan-African one, a mixed one of Dahomey, of Yoruba, of Asante. That's what you have in Haiti, mixed with African or Indian spirit rites. That's real strong, you know? So in this case, whether you are a majority on the land or not, that's not what's determining what's happening when it comes to intact spirit systems. In this case, it's what is the so-called religious system of the oppressor. And notice with Toussaint, we covered him, he was both into Catholicism and into voodoo, which is pretty much how African systems subvert European ones. They'll get in it and hide behind it and still practice theirs. But because of his inculcation with certain European ideas, he took them more seriously than the average African did, but was still a master practitioner of voodoo of the highest order, you know? So this is a case where African spirit practices are continuing. Now, it's more complex than that, and we'll get into that in a minute. Everything's more complex than that. That's one of the things I liked with the interview on Hoppy. The sister was asking some good questions, like when we're dealing with the stages of consciousness, does it all go one way? Now, that's a real smart question, because if it does, it ain't real. You know what I mean? Oh, no. There's nuances upon nuances upon nuances. If you're talking about assimilation, that ain't just one thing. And if you're taking Clarence Thomas up as the example, there ain't too many like him. That's extreme. But if you nuance it, it's more complex. You know what I mean? There's nuances of this. You know what I mean? So when it comes to the spirit thing, we'll come back to it. But the African in America was no less affected by this continuation of African spirit systems, when overall the whites have the majority status, but you're going to find that's more complex than that. Whereas in the islands, they were 98% usually of the people in the islands. Numbers didn't matter in that circumstance. So again, E. Franklin Fraser is talking about African culture prevails in the Caribbean, and it was wiped out here for a variety of reasons. And the main one he would know is because the African was a majority in the Caribbean. Well, African culture prevails, whatever our overall numerical status is. The one that's created here is more complex. But in the case of the spirit systems, it ain't got to do with numbers. So this is a key point. It's got to do with the vigilance of the system that's intact being practiced by the oppressor. And Protestantism is just a lot less tolerant. But there's some other reasons. I've been doing some real research now. I can't even share with you because this is something I'm getting ready to do something else. This book that's going to come after these, the two that I'm finishing now, and then the one on the San Francisco Freedom Movement, that one is going to be the mother's mother. Oh, when I'm writing, only 2 or 3 people know what my new stuff is. So you're just going to have to wonder. But I'm telling you, I got something that is so bad. So bad. I ain't been writing for about 3 weeks because I just been reorienting myself to some of this stuff. That's always what happens when I'm writing a book. I always get to the next one. But this is more than a book because all of these are systems of our life. And this culture is at the core of it. So Obeah prevails in those areas that the spirit practices that come out of Yoruba, Asante, Dogon, that have heavily focus on magical things and divination things and protecting people through various spiritual ways, and it gets a bad name. And some people use it in the wrong way, so it gets that bad name. But it is the vestige of this African system that can survive under this Protestant system. So this is a key point. So in this case, it's more complex. It's not just that the Caribbean is different. One's just more African. In this case, one is not more African. It's different circumstances that dictate what kind of spirit system is going to prevail. So Fraser, in asserting that African culture was lost in the U.S., he incorrectly assumed that one reason for this was because Africans were enslaved on small plantations, where it was easier for whites to stamp out African culture, because close contact with whites should take you into a position where you become more oriented towards their culture. And certainly there's some proof for that in that house slaves tended to take on more of the culture of whites because of proximity, closeness to whites than field slaves. But that is even more complicated than it appears to be. But the key point is this assertion that Africans were enslaved on small plantations largely. The question is that true? Huh. He didn't present data. You know what I mean? He didn't present data. So here's an important fact and important truth about this history here. The number and percentage of small plantations in the United States did exceed the number and percentage of small plantations in the Caribbean or South America. That's true. Because you had absentee plantation owners. They got as big a plantation as possible and had these whites up here managing them, some brainwashed blacks too. So that's true that the percentage of small plantations was larger in the U.S. than in the Caribbean. That part is true. But when you do the data and when you do the analysis, which I have in the integration trap, generation gap caused by a choice between two cultures, what you find is that in the United States, half of enslaved Africans in the United States were enslaved on plantations with 20 or more enslaved Africans. 25% of these Africans were enslaved on plantations with 50 or more Africans. Half of the Africans in the United States were enslaved on large plantations, and some of them were extremely large, 2, 3, 4, 500 people. Now, that is making a case for something different, because if we were all enslaved on small plantations, then it's going to be harder for you to communicate with your own brothers and sisters and make things out and continue or recreate culture. So the fact that over half of our people were enslaved on large plantations is extremely important. And I assume that E. Franklin Fraser didn't know this. Ignorance is no excuse. In court, If you go up claiming you didn't know that it was a crime to shoot somebody, you think that's going to get you off? Now, I'm not saying he did that, because what he said wasn't as obvious, and I don't think he intentionally did this, but he didn't do the homework on this, So the fact that a majority of Africans in the U.S. were enslaved on large plantations mean that it provides a good environment for transmitting culture. Now, you might say it's not good because it's slavery, but what I mean is by having a lot of your people around, you're able to do things outside of the eye of your oppressor a lot, because they ain't got enough people to police you. That's the reason why a pure form of African culture prevailed in the Caribbean. They didn't have nearly enough. You know what I mean? So here's the important fact. With this number of over 50% of our people being enslaved on large plantations, it means that this is ground for real cultural transmission. Now, this doesn't mean that whites didn't try to continue to suppress the culture. They did. You know what I mean? They did. I don't care how large the plantation was. The thing is, they couldn't handle those numbers. Now, there's another point to stress, and this is something I found real interesting. There were some blacks enslaved on the East Coast, some in the Midwest, where there were very few blacks. What's interesting about those studies, when you study them, the African culture was as strong in those areas where there were few blacks as it was in the Black Belt areas. And I'll give you one example. George Washington Carver, he was enslaved in Kansas City and was in the presence basically of the enslaver, Carver, and a few people that a blood brother, and then a few other enslaved Africans. But he was surrounded by white people, That's why he played an accordion. He didn't have no access to the instruments that black people would play, and was an accomplished musician. But guess what? He carried on the deepest principles of African culture, comes out of slavery, and is the greatest scientist in the world in the 20th century and so far in the 21st century. It's going to be hard for anybody to beat him. And if they do, it's going to be another African, but they're going to have to be solidly grounded as he was. And so he retained the deepest principles of African culture, in this particular case, the Seba culture, S-E-B-A, which is the word for teaching or instruction in Kemet. He had the idea of how you kept being yourself through the exact way that the Kemites described it. You got to read my book on Seba to get that one. I ain't giving it to you. Read the book. Some of you ain't going to read a book no matter what, but some of you will. Hit the book, baby. But please believe me, it kept him on track. George Washington Carver always said, I only want to be myself. And then he's an expression of something else. Again, he's not around black people. Henry Ford gave him a blank check. He could put $1 billion on it. Ford would have put it in a bank. George Washington Carver said, no, if I do that, my people won't get credit for it. What was he expressing there? Race consciousness. That's a new creation that we created here. That's why I call it a new African culture. Some things continued. Some things continued in revised form. And some things are brand new. Race consciousness is brand new, born of the circumstance that, A, over time, we lose a memory of what part of Africa we came from. But B, we're observing what is dictating the hell coming on our head. It's the color of our skin. And so as a basis of that, race consciousness is rooted in our blackness. The African in America is the most race conscious. The African in South Africa is pretty race conscious too, but the most race conscious of all Africans. And generally, if you find continental Africans who are race conscious, those are Africans who've usually come to the West and got exposed to a good dose of racism. Kwame Nkrumah, for example, spent 10 years, the great president of Ghana, got exposed to that. Or Ho Chi Minh, at least he knew about it because he traveled around the United States, the leader of the Vietnamese Revolution, who was inspired to revolt by Marcus Garvey, the Honorable Marcus Garvey. But that the race consciousness is so basic to us, it's a part of our bone marrow. We're conscious of race being involved in something when race ain't got nothing to do with it. But most of the time, we're right. Race does have something to do with it. So here's a guy coming out of a largely white environment, and he's got the essence of how you transmit excellence, which is the 7 teachings that come out of Kemet. And he is committed to the deepest principles of this new African thing, race consciousness. One thing George Washington Carver couldn't stand was a self-hating Black person. He couldn't stand it. You hear me talk a lot about him for good reason. When someone appears on this earth of the qualities that he had, you got to do nothing but praise. You hear me? And since he's got some keys for the salvation of the planet, which, by the way, he figures in the 2nd chapter of the book that I'm finishing now, because I'm back to writing in this book. His spirit science is the path to saving the planet from ecocide. That's the genocide of the planet, at least of living forms. Planet will still be here, but we won't if this stuff doesn't change. So get this also straight. I'm revolutionary. I'm taking the past, using it to apply it to the present so you can change it, to resculpt your soul, to get a greater harmony within yourself, and then make that a reflection of the larger society that we need to create, to take what's crooked and make it straight. Something Malcolm and King and others, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker and others have been working on. So another reason that enslaved Africans in the U.S. could continue a key African cultural practice and practices in the U.S. Is because enslaved Africans were a majority in most southern states or were a significant minority. This is contrary to popular opinion. Again, E. Franklin Fraser missed that, and he should have known that one. You know what I mean? And so even though the overall situation was one where whites were in the majority, if you're looking at the southern states, there were a number of southern states where Blacks were the majority, and in others, near majorities. Now, what that allows for is a tremendous transmission of culture. It also allows for a tremendous potential for revolt. Of course, that would be my interest, you know what I mean? The culture leading to revolt, trying to overthrow the system. So let's look at the data on this. And I'm not going to give you all, well, I'll give you a lot of the data, not all of it, but it's enough. The state that posed the greatest threat to slavery was South Carolina. And that's the state that had the largest percentage of Blacks, 57% of the population of South Carolina was Black. And by the way, John Locke, whose constitutional ideas helped shape the hypocrisy of what's called this democracy, he helped write the Constitution of South Carolina, you know? So that's where your greatest slave rebellion occurred, led by Denmark Vesey with his chief lieutenant, Gula Jack. And so our culture is supposed to have evaporated, huh? Well, explain this. How is it that Gula Jack led the African regiments? Those are the saltwater regiments. Those are the ones coming directly from Africa. And so they were under his command. That don't sound like the culture was ended in America. This is pure African culture right here, you know. And so one thing that Fraser's hypotheses about people being sent to plantations and then around brain dead Africans who don't know anything about Africa is that there was a constant infusion of new Africans into this country until the so-called slave trade was abolished. And I'll get into that in a minute. But in the case of South Carolina, the rebellion was an expression of pure African culture, Gula Jack leading it, an Angola priest who had the ability to take house Negroes and turn them into field Negroes. And in fact, they had turned the governor of South Carolina into revolutionaries who were prepared to poison the governor of South Carolina. And in fact, it was Gula Jack that could turn a house Negro into a field Negro. And Denmark Bessie's advice was to leave him alone. Gula Jack could actually flip him. You know what I mean? So this rebellion was a reflection of both African culture and new African culture. And in the case of Denmark Vesey, he was a member of the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, where they planned the rebellion. And the minister of the church purposely left town. You know, I mean, in case it failed, he didn't want to get hung, but he supported it. You know, huh? It's what you call a functional African. Functional. And so Denmark Vesey was using Old Testament arguments. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. An arm for an arm and a leg for a leg. Huh? And he was using constitutional arguments. He was bringing in all the other stuff, but that's New African. Huh? So it was a mixture, right? And the numbers didn't hurt. And of course, his biggest argument was this: strike the first blow. Haiti will support us. Now, his plan was to kill all the whites, take the ships, and go to Haiti, because he wasn't foolish enough to think that Haiti was going to be able to bring an army to liberate you. In fact, Haiti didn't have much of a navy that ship an army over on. So he knew that they'd have to strike that blow themselves and then get hacked, because he knew the rest of the United States of America would be coming after him. But the key point is that number, 57%, gave him the possibility of pulling something off. So other states, if we look at this, Mississippi, 55% of the population was Black, and Mississippi is the hellhole of hellholes. You hear me? 55% of the population of Louisiana was Black, and they got some voodoo too. Huh? 47% of Alabama was Black. 45% of Georgia was Black. 33% of North Carolina was Black. 31% of Virginia, and that's where the founding daddies came from. Huh? They were Black. So look at these numbers here. Texas, 30% was Texas. Texas ain't really in the South, but it has a South mind, ripped off from Mexico, And the Mexicans had abolished slavery. That was one of the real disagreements that the whites who wanted Texas had with the Mexican government. They had actually freed the enslaved. Well, the first leader of the Mexican, revolution was African. And of course they eliminated it. But that's not the picture you get of the Battle of the Alamo with TV and all that stuff. A bunch of slave masters, a bunch of savages. You understand? And still behaving that way in the way they run the state of Texas right now. So a large number of enslaved Africans therefore come from states, a few in which they're a majority, and a significant number where they are a substantial minority. And so that provides a sea for the fish to swim, a sea for them to communicate, a sea for them to plan, and a sea for them to put things together. And by the way, the Denmark-Vesey Rebellion was the best planned rebellion in the history of the United States, based on a cell structure. And when they were finally betrayed by a house Negro, almost all the leaders went to the grave without giving up anything, but the few that did could only give up that part of the cell that they knew, which was maybe 7 or 8 people. So it was the sophistication of that organization, not just their numbers, the brilliance of its leaders. That was key. So this scared whites to death. That's why every time they went to bed, they had to have a gun next to them and stuff like that. And when old Nat Turner got to them, well, the gun didn't do any good. Now, according to E. Franklin Fraser, the 2 key reasons that African culture couldn't survive in the United States was because we were packed in small numbers and shipped to different plantations where enslaved blacks had a dim memory of Africa. So that's his argument. We've seen that a number of the plantations where blacks would be sent, blacks had the numbers. And some of them in states that they were sent, was a constant fresh intrusion of Africans coming from Africa. So how could they have a dim memory of Africa? But that was true throughout the southern states. There was a constant infusion of Africans coming in from Africa. And by the way, for the most part, the enslaved Africans had a high view of their brothers and sisters coming from Africa. They would make statements like they were possessed of African bravery. That was symbolic of them. John Henry Clark became the scholar he became because his grandmother taught him about Uncle or his grandfather Buck, who was a big, brave African who took no mess from African people. Every time the grandmother got around to teaching anything, it was about her husband. And that was when John's interest in Africa arose. These weren't Africans that didn't have any knowledge of Africa. These were Africans with the spirit of Africa. You hear me? And that wasn't just first generation. It got passed on. Well, some other things got passed too. But the key point, it wasn't a simple thing of just shipping people off in small numbers to places where people suffered from amnesia, and they just floated into becoming American Negro slaves. That might be the mentality of some people. I'm not saying Fraser had this, but it might be the mentality of some of our scholars who are doing this work. Some of us who have this position that we didn't, we didn't continue our culture, but that wasn't the mentality of most of our people. So these large numbers on these plantations provided fertile ground for passing on African culture, continuing it, and in revised form, practicing it. And that's not to say other cultural intrusions didn't come in. They did. Not to say that. So this dim view of dim memory of Africa, that's a hard one to support when we see what's going on here. You know what I mean? Constant reinfusion of Africans coming from Africa. Second generation, as we looked at what happened in Haiti, second generation Africans still having a connection with the first generation, separated or not, the extended family community is going to keep them in contact with others who are. And so there's going to be a constant exchange and dialogue going on between these two groups. And so this importation of enslaved Africans into America, that is Africans into America, continues until 1808. And it's in 1808 that a ban is put on the further importation of Africans into the US. But that didn't mean that they stopped coming in after that, because there was no rigid enforcement of this. Why? Because the South had power and there was no real intention of stopping this in a serious way in the North. And so Africans still started coming in. So you have Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote a book on the last slave. And, a very interesting book, and showing the mentality of the people who had come in and how they were relating to Africans who were here, and their effort to build an African village at the end of slavery, because they were, still coming out of an African thing, which is the same thing that a number of Africans did after slavery, which was to build all Black communities, African communities. So the crux of Fraser's argument is that Africans were shipped in small numbers on small plantations, separated from each other by ethnic groups, and therefore couldn't communicate. And so that was a pure recipe for cultural destruction. This is his argument. And also being shipped to plantations with people speaking different languages, they couldn't even talk to each other. Well, first of all, they started developing what we now call Ebonics, but secondly, this argument misses something else. The Africans that were brought here, and I'm going to get into this in the next part, they came from certain groupings, mainly West and Central Africa. These groupings all shared common cultural unities, but that's true of Africa in general. And one of the most common features of African culture is bilingualism. Africans generally speak multiple languages. Dr. Theophile Obenga speaks 10 languages. His mother spoke multiple languages. That's where he got his gift, but that's a common gift in Africa. So if you think that because you're put among other ethnic groups and you can't communicate, well, yes, you could. First generation, you would know how to speak someone else's language. And second generation and third, you created some new basis for communication. But what you're going to see is that ain't what happened. Most Blacks weren't just willy-nilly separated like that. That is the biggest argument that most people have bought into when they say we have no culture. We were separated from our people. We couldn't communicate. And it's always the mighty whitey argument. You know what I mean? Mighty whitey did this. And it's like you weren't doing anything. Our people were fighting the whole darn time. So there's a groundbreaking book on this, and it's written by a brother named Michael Gomez, Gomez. He's an Afro-Puerto Rican. And his book is entitled Exchanging Country Marks. Notice I do cite sources. And this is a groundbreaking work. I was fortunate when I was writing The Integration Trap to have read his work. And one of my spiritual daughters, Dr. Catherine John, who's from Jamaica, she's been attending a conference that he holds every year. It's over 1,000 people that assemble because there are Blacks in this country that appreciate we've got a culture. So this is groundbreaking work that he's done. And I've done some research of my own. And so what his research and mine show is this, that while there was some separation, obviously, of families from each other, that was it, the will of whoever was running things. You could be sold in a minute. So that did happen, right? And there were some people separated by ethnic groups. And there was an ethnic group that nobody wanted except people in Virginia. And that was the Igbos, because they were the flying Africans. They committed, suicide because they were so free they couldn't stand any kind of restriction. So there are these qualifications. But the first thing to get straight is that Africans in the U.S. come from specific areas, specific areas in Africa, largely West Africa, and then some Central Africa. So where are they? 13.5% of Africans in the U.S. come from the Senegambian region, Senegambian, Gambia, Senegambian region of Africa. Senegambians come from West Africa. And who are they? The Wolof people of Senegal, the Fobi people, Fulbe, Sonike people, the Sericole people. These are West Africans. And so 13.5% of the Africans brought from Africa to the United States came from this region, Senegambia. Now, how does this work? Because I'm not going through how this worked with every group, so I'm going to just give you a few examples. And the point that's being made here is this. According to Fraser, they just separated us willy-nilly. Well, the data shows this, that Africans were brought in here, a large number of them, because they had specific skills that were needed in specific areas. And those were agricultural skills. Those were also other technical skills. And so certain Africans were concentrated in certain states because of the skill level, agricultural and otherwise. And so this whole idea of just separating people from each other, it ain't that simple. Large areas of the United States, you had a concentration of people coming from the same region of Africa. Now, I don't need to tell you what that means. You want to talk about an opportunity for disseminating culture? That's ideal. Because guess what? Guess what? The money overrules everything else. So let's take an example of how this worked. Between 1760 and 1800, the Senegambian people made up 30% of the population of Louisiana. 30%. And by the way, this also included Bambara, and Malcolm's father is very likely a jar to have been Bambara. They were warrior cultivators. They went to their fields with weapons. Some of them were Muslims, some of them were traditionalists, but the ones who were Muslims were traditionalists. African culture prevailed over Islamic culture. So it didn't matter whether they were traditionalists or not in terms of so-called religion, because in the case of Islam, religion, but the culture prevailed. The people that Malcolm's father probably came from, Bambara, taught their culture the same way the Dogon did, who had absolutely nothing to do with Islam or Christianity. Adunaso, Table of Signs. They learned their culture the same way. So they were subverting Islam. But the key point is they were warrior cultivators and they were builders. And Ajar, Malcolm's father, I've mentioned this before, Ajar was over 6'4", muscular, a warrior, took no mess, and he was a master builder. And all of Malcolm's uncles, his father, they were all master builders, except for some of his brothers in his immediate family. They weren't carpenters, they were master builders, Malcolm became a master builder of men and women, but he had natural building techniques that was recognized when he was in school. He just didn't want to do that. He wanted to do something else. So why would that concentration of Senegambians, including Bambarian people, be concentrated in Louisiana? Because they had the skill of rice, growing rice. And rice is a hard-working enterprise. It takes a lot of skill. And so what you find is the Senegambian population is heavily concentrated in places where they grew rice, such as South Carolina, by the way. By the way. And the Senegambians, in this case, the Bambara, they were highly skilled as blacksmiths, sculptors, wheelwrights, saddlers. Notice a lot of stuff with horses, because as warriors, they fought on horseback a lot. They founded a kingdom called Segu, S-E-G-U. one of the baddest kingdoms on the planet Earth, with a warrior code that would make most warriors look like sissies. The warrior code was you don't engage an opponent if they show any sign of fear. You must leave the battlefield. That's the African warrior code. All other warrior codes are based on masking fear. You hear me? And fear is an illusion. So if you got fear, you're in a world of trouble. You can mask it all you want. You're going to make mistakes. You know what I mean? I'm not knocking people who have it, but you've been trained into that. And you want to have stress and high blood pressure. Fear is at the heart of that. And the things you're fearing are far worse than you think they are. In fact, sometimes they ain't even worth, none of them are worth fearing. So, contrary to E. Franklin Fraser's conclusion that Africans were just scattered helter-skelter, most Africans were brought in here because they had some skills. Now, some of them had common agricultural skills, but even then, those were highly skilled Africans. You understand? And so what you find is there's certain concentrations of certain types of Africans in different states. I've referred to the Georgia peach. That's a certain kind of African woman who's in Georgia, finer than fine. Or the Mississippi black woman. Oh, you want to talk about fine. Or if you want to deal with the Caribbean, the Jamaican black woman. My goodness gracious, because that's a lot of Akan women and men. I mean, you want to talk about beauty? You got to redefine it when you look at that. Finer than fine. And they know it, as they should. And of course, Africans in general, finer than fine. So you're finding then that rather than this helter-skelter thing where you just throwing enslaved Africans wherever you want to throw them, and they're just thrown like the wind, and they're not going to have any roots. In fact, you're bringing in people from different, from the same cultural groups, and with same kind of attitudes and stuff like that. So this is real key. So if we look at generally the concentration of Africans who are brought into the United States, in addition to what I've already mentioned, 16.6% of the Africans brought in the United States came from Sierra Leone, 14.1% from the Gold Coast, Ghana, areas like that, 3% from the Bight of Benin, and 15.6%, a group that's often ignored, from Biafra, that's where Igbos come from, and 25.3% from West Central Africa. And remember, I did a show on how the Twa civilized people from the Niger-Congo region. These are people the Twa civilized that were brought here. And I haven't talked about the Twa here, but underpinning all these cultures is the Twa Foundation. So what's extremely important to understand about this, the cultural regions, is that they all shared a common African cultural unity. And so many of the things that you're going to see, and I'll just hit the top of them, things that African continued as African cultural practices in the United States are common to all these African cultural groups. Contrary, again, to popular opinion that says that Africans couldn't communicate with each other, their cultures were so different, they were just at war with each other. No, they had a common cultural unity. It outweighed the differences. Even though linguistics might be slightly different, their languages came within language groups. And I see Brother Dreamchild has anticipated one of my arguments, which will be the linguistic one. I'm going to conclude on that one. It's the strongest one of all, So the fact that all these different African cultural groups from West and Central Africa share a common cultural unity means that there are certain practices that all of them are going to recognize and are going to adhere to. It's going to be ingrained in them. And I'm going to mention a few of those. And so when it comes to the cultural war of trying to wipe our culture out, cultural unity is a great defense. You hear me? And then the fact that you've got sufficient numbers of people being concentrated together is also part of it. And then what happens in early African-American marriages, if you have, for example, Bambara, not many women were brought. Almost all of them were men. And by the way, one of the things that distinguishes African-American enslavement from Caribbean is it's almost an equal balance of males and females, whereas a huge imbalance in the Caribbean of males might be another reason why polygamy is more popular. But the key point is that, of course, that's a reason for not having, because it's going to deprive a lot of men of a woman. But the key point is that if you're looking at the nature of these different cultural groups, they have a lot in common. So key cultural institutions of Africa continue in the U.S. And these institutions are expressions of African deep culture, African deep thought. And so that stuff is very hard to uproot. Du Bois drew the conclusion, W.B. Du Bois, our best scholar, he drew the conclusion that the sole surviving institution from Africa in the United States was the African priesthood. Now, he's wrong. It wasn't by far the sole, but he was right in that he was focusing on the central institution. And that was the central institution, but it wasn't just the priesthood, it's what the priesthood housed, and that's the principle of spirit. Now, most of our historians make the mistake of ignoring spirit because they say it's a common feature in all cultures. I think the reason a lot of them ignore it is because it's frowned on in this culture. This is a despiritualized culture. And so they want to, be dressed up and look good and be rational and all this. So don't talk about spirit. But it is the driving force of African culture. Of all the unities, it's the greatest one. And of course, it receives it from the Twa. That the Twa give us this legacy. I spent a lot of time on this. So spirit is fundamental. The house for spirit in the Protestant countries, including the United States, is Obia, so diviners. And so the diviner is the one who the Africans look up most to when it comes to leadership. As Du Bois said, he was the healer of the sick, the comforter of the sorrowful, the natural leader of oppressed Africans. And he described he was kind of rough and everything. He wasn't, of course, he didn't have any special clothes to wear and everything else, but he was the wise one. So it's a mistake to ignore this because this is the essence of what you had inside of you, which we all are. As we often say, we're spirits having a human experience. And that's true for all human beings, but our culture is wired that way. Spirit is in everything God created. So you want to talk about the continuation of African culture and then new African culture. The Obia man or woman would be an example of both continuation and transformation, because on the one hand, they're carrying out a central function of the African priest or priestess, divining, which is telling you your future. But they no longer have the opportunity in Protestant countries of training a priesthood, of going through rites that, where you get possessed by spirits, doing a whole lot of other things that the African priesthood does, the training and everything else that goes on, which could happen in voodoo under the Catholic system. So what's happening here is you have the continuation of the essence of African culture, but you also have a transformation under the circumstances. You're using what you can best use, which is the core of it is spirit. And so it's Obia. Now, Obia gets a bad name because there are some that use it in a negative way. But there are also some who use traditional African spirit systems in the wrong way too, but more often fewer because there's a whole mechanism for checking them. But still, Obia is a strong force, and it kept a whole lot of Black people going. But the biggest continuation of spirit is the spirit we carried inside ourselves, and you couldn't take that out. And that's what enabled us to wage war with the European. It is the main reason we didn't become Christians during enslavement. Because, first of all, we weren't into religion. We weren't into theology. We weren't into doctrine. And we surely were not into a system where the people who are telling us, obey your master, which is the last thing that any African was thinking of doing, the Pauline epistles, the African would say, he the devil, because we didn't believe in devil in Africa, but we get the idea of the devil. And they would, by devil, they meant the slave master. When they said devil, the slave master. Why in the hell are they going to embrace their religion, which is telling you to bow down and submit to them? And they would always say, God didn't say that. And all black folks who were ex-slaves, they would say, they would go crazy if you ever mentioned the Pauline epistles. They'd go crazy. You hear me? So the African, again, when it comes to transformation and continuation of African culture, whether it's the pure form or the new form, the repository, the place where spirit resides, is inside the person. And so what do Africans do? I've talked about this before with some of the people on this show. They do things like they go to places where they can experience the spirit directly. That's called the hush harbor. Put their heads under a bucket and call on the spirit until it comes down. Or go to the furthest removed cabin and pull down the spirit. That is basically what the Black church ended up doing when it finally embraces what's called Christianity. It's the voodoo that we had been practicing on the plantation. And so spirit is like the essence of the culture, and it's all over the place. It's in your dreams, it's in your visions, it's what keeps you going. I pointed out that enslaved Africans often lived outside of time, because when you're in this zone, you're in another realm, outside of time, outside of space. And that is God. God is infinite force outside of time, outside of space. You hear me? So this was the big weapon that we waged. And no other weapon worked if it didn't have spirit tied to it. A rebellion wasn't going to get any allegiance unless the spirit was up in it. Nat Turner, the visions he got from God. Denmark Vesey, the visions that were coming along. Harriet Tubman, she wasn't able to avoid all those slave patrols and pull out all those enslaved Africans without spirit visitation. You hear me? Spirit visitation. So this has been real key to the continuation and transformation of African culture. So key institutions of Africa that survived in the U.S. and the Western Hemisphere, because, we're saying that our culture was wiped out. Oh, really? Our great scholar, Carter G. Woodson, a lot of people have read Miseducation of the Negro, but you should read his other works. And one is African History Outline, which is a continuation. It's kind of like offering solutions to problems he posed in Miseducation of the Negro. He makes the point, my own study shows this, anyone that's done their homework on African American or New African culture, and this is true for the Caribbean and South America as well, an institution that was strong is the institution of elderhood. Could not be suppressed. Why? Because all African cultures respected their elders. On the plantation, you didn't look your elder in the eye. It was also always yes, sir, no, sir. You hear me? And in the South, that's still the case. You go to Mississippi, and younger people, they see an elder, sir, can I do this for you? Sir, that's African. Not none of this mess that some of us are getting into right now. You know what I mean? So that's an institution that survives intact. And that's very important, because what ends up happening, see, another principle that's very key, that's basic to African people, is democracy. We give birth to it. It's Twa-based, and then it's carried on at the village level in just about all of Africa. And so when you have Africans coming in here, they've got a sense of having a say-so in things. And they have a resentment to anyone being over them, telling them anything, let alone with a whip. You hear me? That goes against their very nature. And everything we create has this democratic stamp on it, the art form, you know? Jazz, an aristocracy of democracy. That's kind of like the Asante Hina, who's king, and the Santawa in Ghana, they're king and queen. But they're subject to a council, and the council makes the decisions. And the council's made up of opinions or lineage heads who are picked because they are the most just, and they are first among equals, but the decision of the lineage is a consensus. It's going back to the Twa, all the males and females being equally empowered to govern every phase of society. On the smallest levels, that's what's operating. You don't know what's operating on the plantation because it's in secret, but what you do know is when the plantation ends, this is the form of organization most popular among Blacks. What is it? Group-centered leadership. The people are making decisions collectively, and then they'll send somebody out to tell whites what they're going to do. They think that's the leader. The African is saying he ain't got no leaders. And when Frederick Douglass, who was a respected abolitionist, when slavery's over, he's living in Washington, living pretty good, and he moves around the country and speaks among Blacks. Blacks would say this of him: he's not a leader. He was at one point, but he said he's not a leader. Why? Because to be a leader among us, you got to live among us. You got to speak to our needs. And then they say, furthermore, we have to pay when we go to hear him speak. Huh? So the point is, we retained a whole lot. Some of it got revised, some of it got modified, and there was new stuff, of which race consciousness and Pan-Africanism through Ethiopianism is the birthplace of Pan-Africanism. The idea that biblically there's this passage that princes shall come out of Egypt, Ethiopia shall stretch forth its hand under God. And then the Rasta belief in Haile Selassie and everything else, Garvey was an Ethiopianist. He never used the word Pan-Africanist, but he was a practicing Pan-Africanist, more so than anyone of his time, because he was putting on the ground organization to get African independence then, not in the future, as a lot of Pan-Africanists were. So those are new features. This idea of one Africa, this comes from the African in the United States, the African in the Caribbean, particularly Trinidad. You didn't have a culture. You got the most advanced vision of where Africa needs to go. Nkrumah spent 10 years here. He got ingrained with this idea of African unity here. You hear me? And then went back to Africa and brought back Africans from the Caribbean in the US. His best advisor was George Padmore, real name Malcolm Nurse, from Trinidad, who he apprenticed under in the 5th Pan-African Congress, who was a principal organizer of it, with Nkrumah being his assistant. Those are new things shaped here. But you ain't got a culture. Give me a break. You got so much culture that none of us know all of it, because it's the most complex culture on the planet. I don't know all of it. I'm not into theater arts. I can't tell you all of that. I can't play a note. I know something about jazz, but I can't play a note and can't sing. You know what I mean? There's a whole bunch of can'ts. This culture's complex. You hear me? Then there's the athletic culture. I never played basketball. I used to pitch 3 shutouts and no hitters in one season, but I was not professional league material. I was okay in the, high school. That was okay. I wasn't going to be drafted to no major leagues. Plus, I had a sore arm. Most pitchers do. Satchel Paige had a rubber arm. By the way, you want to talk about culture? This is an innovative culture, baby. Satchel Paige. the innovator of pitching. Who ever heard of a person having 3 fastballs? Fast, faster, and fastest. The best batter in baseball was Josh Gibson. Better than any of the white hitters. Babe Ruth couldn't stand up to him. No pitcher in the white major leagues could stand up to Satchel Paige. Satchel Paige was so good that he'd take his whole outfield out. That means all the people that are supposed to catch a ball that's hit far, take them out and pitch against a Josh Gibson, and most of the time strike him out. And that was the best batter in baseball ever. That's how good he was. Could you imagine a pitch that is fast, and then another one that's faster, and then another one that's fastest? And he had a hesitation pitch. That pitch actually stopped for a millisecond. Huh? This culture produces this stuff. Bill Russell, who graduated from McClymonds High School. That's a high school here in Oakland. I live in Oakland, Oaktown, you know. Bill Russell, who won 11 rings, 11 championships out of 13. No one's had that record. And people can talk all day long about Michael Jordan. It's the rings, baby. It's the rings, and it's the team. Bill Russell gave up on shooting, though he had good promise as a shooter. In college, he had good promise. But what he became was that person under the basket that would stop the other player from making a shot, and he could grab a ball and hold it and then pass it to whoever he wanted to. Or he could push it, just hit it and push it always to his other players. He subordinated his ego to the ego of the team. There ain't never going to be a basketball player that in their career, almost all of their career is championships. 4 rings seems to be a big deal right now. You know what I mean? Huh? Bill Russell, who was also political. And he made this comment because this is also a feature of our culture. He said, I'm an innovator. And he said, when you do something new, that's good, you bring beauty to that thing. And he says it's like an art form. In other words, the way he played basketball, also the way he carried his life, was like artistry. You hear me? This culture produces that over and over again. And you run around here talking about, yeah, you got no culture. Give me a break. And as I pointed out before, under the stress, the trial, the strains of enslavement, the savagery of enslavement, in both creating the new and continuing the old, and taking the old and putting it in a new package, we became what we are. The most creative Africans on the planet and the most creative people on the planet. Not because we came from some special creative place in Africa, but because our conditions required it. And so the stuff I was dealing with on the mastery system, we all have gifts. If you want to pursue your gifts to its highest level, then work to be the best you can at it. And again, your culture contains that. So our culture continued the highest apprenticeship mastery system known on the planet, but we don't have a culture. Now, another institution that continued here and that is rarely studied by historians is the institution of secret societies. And I mentioned this before. I've done a lot of study on this. And the secret societies of Africa were really the basis for P.A.P.O, the highest educational systems, House of Life educational systems in ancient Kemet. But they were also recreated under the stress and strain of slavery to continue the culture. in bush schools and stuff like that. And so they were carried into the United States and the Western Hemisphere. And the people who are knowledgeable of this will say that they brought their flags and placed them wherever they went. Now, what that meant is secret societies had flags that were the symbols of the secret societies. And so in the Caribbean, in some cases, they took them directly from Africa and brought them to the Caribbean. So in Cuba, you have the Leopard Society. That is direct transmission coming directly from Africa. People from Sierra Leone, the societies, the secret societies in Liberia, and a good part of West Africa, the P.A.P.O Society. S.N.C.C's rebellion on board the ship Amistad was as a member of the secret societies. And their favorite weapon was a machete. We love knives of various sizes. In fact, it was those same weapons that freed Cuba until America intervened. I was in the museum, the National Museum of Cuba, 82 and 83. And there's a picture of a Cuban soldier, an Afro-Cuban, who was under the leadership of one of the greatest revolutionaries in the world, Antonio Maceo, an African. And he had just engaged a Spanish soldier and sliced him in half with a machete. In half. And that's pretty much what S.N.C.C did. I don't know if he sliced him in half, but he went to work on that, that ship, the Amistad. You know what I mean? So much for we lost our culture in slavery. I want to end with this one. Linguistics. I saw one of our brilliant viewers make a point of this. If you maintain a linguistic system that your people come from, I don't care what you argue, then you have the persistence of your culture, right? The continuation of your culture. There's an African-American linguist, his name is Selassie Williams, and he makes this point about the persistence of African linguistics or the continuation of your own language under circumstances that would try and change it. He makes this point. Most characteristic features of West African languages have been preserved in African American linguistics. Hear that. A lot of us, we want to call this dialect. It's not a dialect, it's a language. It follows certain rules. 80% of Africans in America speak it. And every effort of the school system to eradicate it has failed. They call it broken English. It ain't no broken English. It's African linguistics found in the Caribbean, South America, and the US. It may be a little bit pure in certain parts of the Caribbean than here, but it's basically the same thing. We call it Ebonics here. They have other terms. They call it Creole there. They have other terms. And sometimes they'll call it Creole here, The master on this subject is Lorenzo Dow Turner, Lorenzo Dow Turner. He was the first African-American trained in linguistics. It doesn't mean he was the first one that mastered any language, but he went to language school. And then he decided to specialize in his own linguistics. Not like a lot of Negroes who just want to specialize in white people. You know what I mean? He knew where the gold mine was. And so he studied Gullah dialect, what he called a dialect, a language, spoken in South Carolina and other areas. But then he studied the basic speech patterns of everyday African Americans. Gullah would be like the strongest representation of that. Turner makes the point that African language or linguistic group in the US is based on the Niger-Congo linguistic family, the same one that I referred to before when I was talking about the Twa. You understand? And the Gullah language group that Africans in the US speak is probably referring to the language spoke in Liberia among the Wolof, the Malinke, the Mandinka, the Bambara, the Fula, the Mende, the Bai, the Twi, the Fanti, the Ga. These are the same people that I showed you are the main people that came to the United States of America. Is it any surprise that they would continue to speak this language? In revised form? This is what you call New African. But it's basically fundamentally African. So 80% of Blacks speak this language. And it's the language they feel most comfortable with because it's expressing their philosophy and their view of life. So this is the key point. This is the point that linguists will tell you. And this is the point that Dow Turner makes. He makes this point. And Selassie Williams makes this point also. Let me quote him. Language is that set of internalized subconscious rules, let me stress this, that cannot be easily eradicated. That means it's almost impossible. You hear me? It's so basic to your nature. It's like a dog barking, meaning a dog is going to bark. It's the way of expression. I'm not comparing us to dogs. I'm making the point. That's a natural expression for dogs. Every human being has formed natural expressions that, based on how their grammar is laid out, expresses their attitudes towards life. One feature of African linguistics, there's many, I'm not going into this. I don't have time. One of the key ones is the emphasis on the verb and the verbal noun, the emphasis on action, which is key in African linguistics. Why? Because the philosophy of the African is that to know something, you have to be it. As I've said, this is my formulation. To know the truth, you have to be the truth. The stuff I'm sharing with you, if all you get is this and you quote it, you've got the white way. And if you're not using it to transform yourself, it's the white, not right, W-H-I-T-E way. And that's what most Afrocentrists do. They can quote a lot of stuff and they behave just like Europeans, or maybe a lot like them. You know what I mean? So I'm saying that the linguistic patterns of the African in America ain't much different from that of the African in the Caribbean or South America. And it is at its core Niger-Congo Bantu. The language of the people who came here, your ancestors, they're inside of you. So I rest my case. And by the way, I'm just hitting the top. There's a whole lot more to this. Put me on a stage and let me debate somebody that wants to argue this. I'll really take them to the cleaner. But the key point is you have got this powerful, magnificent, beautiful, complex culture. And you see these hip hoppers, when they drop it off, they come up with their new language and everything. But I pointed this out before. The very word hip is a Wolof expression coming from H-I-P-P-I, cat, hippie cat, one who sees from all sides. I told you before, I got that from Dizzy Gillespie. I cite my sources. If I came up with, I'll tell you. Dizzy Gillespie. Deep thinker. By the way, he came from South Carolina. By the way. There's more voodoo in his IQ than even he knew. It's a little poetry right there. So I rest my case. We were put in a situation where, they tried to wipe everything out. But guess what? We came out with our humanity intact. We came out with scars, but we came out good people. We came out rich people, culturally rich. Note that the greatest number of inventions occur from us right after enslavement. You hear me? Note that. But note the inventive quality of Africans to this day. You hear me? That's at the heart of your culture because you're a creative people. So you can take the worst situations and make them better. You hear me? And so this new African culture you've got is an expression of your African culture. And as you draw deeply into the African well, you'll strengthen it. But the fact is, that's the recreation you made right here. That's why a king could carry himself with the nobility that he did. An Ella Baker could do what she did. You understand? Because it's that African inside of them. So all of this about self-knowledge. The more you know about yourself, the stronger you are. And the more you know about yourself, the more you can do to bring beauty into the world, which is what this is all about. So just remember, your culture is the popular and classical culture of the United States and the world. It's grounded in freedom. I didn't go into how we handled that, but that's at the core of the culture. And wherever it's moved in the world, it inspires people to rise up and produce change in the world. I don't care if it's the music. I don't care if it's a message coming from one of our leaders. I don't care what it is. If it's rap, if it's got a conscious message, whatever it is, it encourages people to stand up and to be themselves. So I hope you got something out of this. This went longer than I've been doing lately. Hotep. So let's see. Brother Shabazz. Okay. Brother's saying he's teaching a class on African American culture. So I hope you got something out of this, brother. I'm sure you do a good job with it. Travel light. I am African. I bet you are. You better be. Wally Smith, while your work today called out so many of our genius, a brilliant presentation. You referenced Zora, Neal, Hurston, and Carter G. Woodson, and Nkrumah to Padmore. Yeah, thank you. Oh, it's the brilliance of our people. You got to stand on the shoulders of the people who have done great work, acknowledge their work, and then move to the next level, but draw from their work. And these are mighty people. And Zora Neale Hurston is so mighty that no adjectives can fully explain her. And this woman wrote so many books that are just coming out because it was in the age of poverty and she had some white woman sponsoring her. And so she had to give her a book, but then at the same time had 2 or 3 that hadn't been published. You know what I mean? And a lot of these are being published now. You know what I mean? This woman, but she was grounded in the culture. She loved her people. And one of the things I like most about her is her use of linguistics. She was beautiful. And then showed you how the philosophy worked from that. The person from Society, I appreciate you. Tell me, are you coming from Africa? If so, what part? Put it up there. You know, glad to have you. You know, let's see if we have any more. Brother Shabazz, E. Franklin Fraser also worried that African survivals would undercut the push for full citizenship rights. If you can't assimilate whiteness, you can make citizenship claims. Good point. Yeah, good point. But logically, why should that weaken you? Especially since if you got the European American who is controlling this operation, he drops every part of his culture, most of which is not worth dropping. When I say dropping, spreads it, you know? So he can keep his, but we're not supposed to keep ours. And then if you look at the Native American, what was the condition for them? Physical genocide and cultural genocide. So that's a form of oppression. You're not going to be free if you're somebody else, you know. Between race consciousness in African USA and Africans in Latin America. Brother Shabazz, curious to hear your view of the role of one drop for Black consciousness. I think it was a crucial distinction between race. Yeah, the one drop rule that if you just have one drop of Black blood, then you're Black. Except there's a lot of white people around who got it. In fact, if that rule was really enforced, everybody would be Black because all humanity comes out of Africa. So Black is in everybody. You know what I mean? There are pure Africans that have nothing else in them but African, but everybody else is mixed. So in the case of the one drop rule, yeah, that becomes the dividing line for distinguishing Black and white. But the key point for African people is that the distinction is that it's who do you belong to? Who is your mother? Who is your father? And who do you identify with? And so that's race consciousness. And the key thing is that you're identifying your oppression based on the color of your skin, whether it's light or dark, you catch hell the same way. And so that is what ends up forging what becomes the definition of race for Black people in this country. So you have some Blacks who are light complexion and very brainwashed. And you have some Blacks who are very light complexion and very conscious. And you have some Blacks who are very dark complexion and very conscious, and some who are self-hating. So in the end, race consciousness has a message, and it's really your consciousness that is key. And in the United States, it's much harder to determine what a people's view is going to be on colorism, that is among Blacks. In the Caribbean, generally colorism is clearer, you know. And it's interesting because with a smaller number of whites present in the Caribbean, there's a real privileging of people with light skin. But in the United States, it's more complex. In the United States, a lot of, for example, dark-skinned sisters will have trouble with some brothers who are light complexion because they're worried that they're taking on the mentality of white people and may regard them in the same way. And Blacks at the extreme end catch the most hell among Blacks, the most light complexion and the most dark complexion, because of the way the color thing works in this country. You know what I mean? And can catch a lot of hell from Blacks as well as in the spectrum of racism, especially the spectrum of racism, dark-skinned Blacks catch more hell. In the spectrum of colorism between light and dark-skinned Blacks, Blacks can put as much hell on a light-skinned Black person as a dark-skinned one. I know, but it never bothered me because I don't give a 2 cents what somebody thinks of me. As long as I'm doing right, I know I'm Black. If you got a problem with it, it's your problem. You know what I mean? That's my thing. But so a key distinguishing point in enslavement was this. When it comes to color, particularly with light-skinned Blacks, the question was, who did you identify with? And if you didn't identify with your own race, and if you were in that position, you were then suspended between two worlds. You were not, you didn't want to be a part of the Black race, and whites definitely ain't going to have you a part of theirs. And so I've made this point before. This comes out of the slave narratives. Blacks in that condition were called no nation. They used the N-word, no nation. And that's telling you that the masses of Black folks saw themselves as a part of a nation, a cultural nation made up of Black people. But if you didn't want to be a part of it, fine. And there's a lot of conversations on that if you read the slave narratives, and of course, right up to today, you'll see. And so for the African who's light complexion, but not clear on where they belong, they're in suspended animation. That's a real problem. That's a real problem. It will cause misery in their life because they don't know who they are, misery, So it's a complex thing. In the end, it's a question of the color of your mind. And as Maulana Karinga, he used to have a saying, the only integration we need is between dark-skinned blacks and light-skinned blacks. And I would add to that, dark-skinned, dark-minded blacks. That's the key. You need an integration of whether a person's light or dark or not. It's the color of your mind. That's the key. Lao Tzu, good question. Can you give us a definition of culture? Also, what are the chances of Marimba Ani appearing on your show? The first chapter of Yurugu focuses on culture. Overall, I would say that culture is your way of life. It's your design for living. Culture is subliminal as well as conscious. It's what is embedded in you, as well as what you're conscious of. And so a lot of expressions that people have that are cultural expressions, they're not even aware that they're expressions of their culture. It's so natural to them. Some jazz musicians are not aware that when a band leader has a preference for head music as opposed to written music, that's an expression of their oral culture. They're not aware of that. Or they know it's oral, but they don't know where it's coming from, that it's African. And I think culture reflects your deep thought. It's the deepest stuff that guides you, Culture is something that you can't live without. It's like water. It's your nourishment. And the more you drink, they advise you to drink a certain amount of water every day. That nourishes you. It's the same thing with culture. Culture does that, and it nourishes you. It makes you healthier. In fact, it's the source of health, And then, of course, there's the positive aspects of culture and there's the negative. All cultures have both. And so the question is, which one are you embracing? You need to negate the negative, identify it, and work your way out of it if it's inside of you, and embrace the positive. All features of African culture are not positive. Well, the bulk of it is, and that's true for all cultures. So that's kind of a overall thing. That's a good question, Lao Tzu. And as Marimba Ani, I tried to reach her. I haven't been able to get a return call. Ed Donaldson, my third great grandfather is Fulani, and that was transplanted to Louisiana from Lauderdale to a plantation with many Bambara. Yeah, Fulani, they strong in the warrior systems. Many of them were Muslims. Some of them were brought in as house slaves because enslavers thought that Muslims would make better house slaves, but Fulani took no mess. And, they shared cultural unities in certain ways. Bambara and them are similar. A lot of Bambara are Muslim, not all of them, but they were nominal in that African culture drove it. Brother Dreamchild, brother came across it from another member of my book, Radical Revolutionary Book Study Group, that did some searches on the internet. So he's referring to something else. Brother Shabazz, check Black Rice by Carney for Low Country, South Carolina rice cultivators, primarily Senegambia. Okay, that's probably what Dreamchild's referring to. I'll check that out myself. Right. Brother Dreamchild had anticipated my linguistic thing, though I didn't go into it, didn't have time. Very important. Okay, I flashed the book, and that's Brother Shabazz. I didn't know I flashed it that fast. Integration Trap, Generation Gap caused by a choice between two cultures. If you click into the description of this show, Gumroad will come up and you can order it, you know, and then we mail it to you. You don't go to Amazon and buy it. I talk all this Afrocentric talk, and you're taking the richest person in the world, or the second richest, and further enriching him. You know what I mean? Brother Shabazz, Haiti was so race conscious that Dessalines put it in their constitution. Yeah, good point. Dessalines was definitely race conscious. The only people who could own land in Haiti was black, and his definition of black was you had a drop of black blood in you, were black, you know, none of this other stuff. Yeah. Let's see here. Okay, let's go down here and see what else is going on. Lao Tzu, does culture enhance group cooperation? Also, have we looked at African cooperation before European and other foreign contacts? Oh, yeah, sure. Because basically, if you look at, for example, our liberation movements, the biggest downfalls in them have been whatever contradictions people have had around their own identity, their own sense of self-love and self-respect and self-knowledge, and therefore their own sense of being able to express that towards their own people. So when you see some of the behavior that has occurred in some groups, I won't name them, that have been pretty abusive towards their own people, if not always, at times. That's an expression of the fact that they haven't internalized their own culture. They have some of it, but there are cracks in it. You know what I mean? And it can lead to arrogance. It can lead to people despising their own people. It can lead to groups, particularly leaders, putting people in harm's way when you shouldn't, you know, because if you love somebody, you're not going to do that. You don't put your children in harm's way, you shouldn't, or your wife. Why would you do it to a group? Or punishments that some groups have imposed on their members that go straight back to the plantation, using the bullwhip and all this kind of stuff. Specific groups coming out of the 60s did this, particular ones, or torture and all this stuff. You know what I mean? So if you haven't got this full deep love of yourself, this will come out and you'll blame it on the FBI did it to me. I was under pressure. Forgive me. You know what I mean? Huh? You know what I mean? So yeah, it promotes cooperation. Love promotes cooperation. I mean, it's kind of like asking, do you think that loving your wife contributes, or your wife loving you contributes to cooperation? Oh, I would think so. Doesn't mean everything's going to be nice, but it means that, yeah, there's going to be some cooperation. Have we looked at African cooperation before European and other foreign contacts? Yeah. I mean, if you study African history, it's full of that. I mean, it's full of that. And for the most part, before the coming of Islam and Christianity, the conflicts that Africans had was minimal. And even when you did have warfare, it was minimal. But for long periods of time, Africans lived in peace, long periods of time. Why? One, invaders had not come in. Two, these were societies that took care of basic needs: food, clothing, shelter, communalism, sharing. They didn't have great, most of them, some did. Most of them had these great extremes of wealth. Most of them did not, because you couldn't grab a whole lot of land. That was usually the basis for wealth. And in peaceful times, it's not people running around empowering themselves over other people. And then you had this whole thing, because of the way African social or family systems work, real balance in the family relationships, for women generally treated good in African systems. And that's what really distinguishes African culture from European culture, treatment of women. Whenever you see in ancient history societies that you don't normally associate with being African, but probably are, like the Etruscans, who were the people that lived in the area of Italy that Italy overwhelmed and did in. You know who they are by these descriptions. A, their language was not Aryan. B, they treated women good. You know that's not an Aryan. You know that. And that's the basis for cooperation. I mean, you want real cooperation? It's the way you treat your women. And if you treat your women right, then you're going to treat others right. And in fact, I pointed this out before. Some of the Arabs who traveled in Africa pointed out that when they were looking at civilizations like Mali, for example, Ibn Khaldun, who was an Arab historian, he didn't like it either. He liked the beauty of these black women. Oh, he never saw women so pretty. But what he didn't like was that women were actually treated better than men. Think about that one. We're always thinking about just being treated as good. They were actually treated better. I pointed this out before. He goes into the house of a highly ranked Malian, and his wife is entertaining her boyfriend. Because this is a society that inclines towards women. And so they'd like to have a boyfriend. So that's what they get. And the man goes along with it, like it or not, because that's the society that treats women good. You could say they treat them too good. Well, that would be your perspective, not the woman's, you know. So, yeah, not only could we get along with other people, including others like us. Remember, there was no concept then of Africa, all of us being of one brotherhood, but we were of one culture. So, yeah, that happened. Ed Donaldson is pointing out he got introduced to Lorenzo Dow Turner by Ernie Smith. Yeah, Ernie Smith was a great expert on African linguistics. Rob, I'm looking forward to your San Francisco book. I was raised in the city. My mother was proactive at Glide Memorial Church. Yeah, that's one that I have to do and finish. And some of the people that you'll see on the film that we're doing to honor Dengani, these are people that will also be featured in the book. They were major leaders in the Black Freedom Movement. So I guess that's it. You can see this is another one of my passions. My people. And therefore, our culture. So I've enjoyed it, y'all. Hope you got something out of this, you know. And next week, it'll be John Handy. I want to say, for those that haven't subscribed, hit the subscriber button and make a donation. You know, when you click into the description of the show, you can make a donation, because all of this costs money. I pay a person that's a computer person. This film I'm doing is costing me money. So make a little donation. And some of you want to consider it, make a monthly one. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to be anything heavy, but it would help out. It's not going into my pocket. I doubt if in the whole period of doing this show, I'd recover what I've already put in. So, you know, help out and tell other people about the show. and watch next week's show, which will be a discussion with one of the greatest jazz musicians ever, John Handy, and on jazz, which is a complex and beautiful music. So Hotep, and enjoy the rest of your day.